I think from what you said, you welcome questions throughout the course of the presentations. So we're discussing the NSS and fee implications, and each speaker for about 15 minutes. Rather than do formal introductions, I think what I'd ask you to do is if you could say a little bit about yourself as you begin, and we're going to go in the order of the programme. So if you don't mind starting, Alan, that would be great.
Yeah, hi, thank you. My name's Alan Farmer, I'm Head of Policy and Research at Million Plus. If you don't know Million Plus, we are a university think tank. Our affiliated members are drawn from the modern university sector, so that's universities that achieved title after 1992. The kinds of things we do, research, reports, consultation responses, the normal advocacy and lobbying activities, particularly interested in the issues around part-time education, mature learners, what is often referred to as non-traditional pathways, vocational education, those sorts of agenda. We've recently been doing a lot of work on research funding and challenging some of what we see as the hyper-concentration of research in a small number of universities. I won't go any further than that, but you know what I'm saying. So that's just by way of a bit of background. I'm probably not going to speak for my 15 minutes because I think it would be useful to get on to questions. And also, I'm not sure whether my view of the NSS from my background would match your view, being that you're from institutions. So by way of background, I used to work for HEFCE, and I was there when the NSS started, and I never worked on it. So it's been sort of on my radar for quite some time, and I subsequently left HEFCE and joined the British Academy, was there for a couple of years, so looking at the NSS from both sides of the fence, so to speak. I think what I take from this is it's quite an unusual thing to talk about the NSS because it's always, the conversations I have about it, they always look at what the problems are. And it's a negative conversation about the NSS. And it's it's bureaucratic, it's problematic, it's just a league table tool, that's not very helpful, it's not very subtle, it's not very nuanced, and so on and so forth, all those conversations I have. But I just looked up this morning some background and went onto HEFCE's website and looked at some of the things that they've published, and disregarding the issues that people have with the notion of surveying satisfaction and the proxies that is then used for. Last year, 86% of students that responded to the survey were overall satisfied by their course. Now, I'm not too sure that there are many areas of consumer services or products or whatever we would like to refer to ourselves as who would beat themselves up over the fact that 86% of their customers, in inverted commas, are satisfied, or more importantly, that 14% of their customers are not satisfied. Actually, only 5% were dissatisfied and 2% were strongly dissatisfied. So I think it's very interesting that we've got ourselves as a sector into this position because of the various issues that people have about the NSS and the various concerns with it. And I think some of those are genuine, and I think some of them stem from the fact that what the NSS was set up to do is perhaps not what it's being used for now. So if you remember some of the language, and there's no reason why you shouldn't, you weren't sitting around desks in HEFCE at the time, but TQI was the phrase used, teaching quality information. And that's where, and we had a TQI committee and all sorts of things. And that's where this stemmed from, public information and TQI. And there was a whole host of work about whether you could judge teaching quality in the same way that, well, not in the same way, whether you could judge teaching quality, given that there is a way of judging research quality that is relatively accepted as a consensus across the sector. And the people that want to do that are the people who pay for it, government. They want to be able to say, our money is making a difference, or this is where the best way of investing money. So that it was originally a proxy for quality. And even at the time, people were concerned whether that was the right proxy for quality. Should you even be measuring teaching quality? Can you do it in the way that meets those needs? And I think when you had nothing, as we did then, relatively speaking, it possibly was a good idea. It was a good idea. And it achieved an awful lot. I think what's happened now, especially in the last couple of years, is that it's turned from potentially an unsatisfactory proxy for quality into a tool for consumer regulation. And it's being used to drive conversations about whether students are getting value for money from their fees, and whether it's driving choice or not. And I think we'd all recognise that the choices prospective students make are numerous and complex and aren't necessarily driven by that. I mean, you'll be talking to people all the time, and I bet most of them don't make their choices on the basis of where the university was in the Stats League table. It might have an influence, but there's a whole host of other factors. Particularly if you're not a student or you have other commitments that restrict your choice to be influenced by all that information. So I think genuinely there are concerns, and there have been concerns. They have changed, I think. I think one of the big issues we've got at the moment is that the conversations about NSS and the way in which, even the one which I just expressed it, you end up creating a barrier about what is actually trying to happen, which is students and university lecturers and universities sectors working together to improve the experience of all involved, and particularly the quality of the experience that the students have. And when it comes down to where someone is on a league table and bouncing yourself up and down that league table, from 86% satisfied to 87% satisfied, I'm not quite sure how that makes a difference, but that's what happens, and that is how people are judged. And Board of Governors will look at the stats and now say to their university executives, well, why are we at 88? Why are we only at 87? Did you think Sainsbury's board worried about things like that? And it then turns into a very media-driven conversation about, well, students are dissatisfied and there's sectors a load of rubbish and there's that poor value for money, and look at all these contact hours, know what he's doing, and Mickey Mouse degrees, and University X have 1,000 complaints. Isn't that disastrous? Despite the fact that if you have a good complaint system.
Sorry, can you just speak up a little bit?
Yeah.
I'm losing you.
Oh, I'm sorry. What did you last hear?
Hello. Mickey Mouse.
Mickey Mouse degrees.
Maybe you just rock it back a little bit.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry, I did go back, didn't I? So it turns into those media-driven analyses of poor numbers of contact hours, Mickey Mouse degrees, stories about complaints. And when you unpick those, I think we all know that contact hours is no proxy for anything. Mickey Mouse degrees are some of the, if you believe in that term, don't believe in that term, I should say, they have some of the highest employment rates, employability rates, they have very successful careers, students are choosing to do those degrees. I think that then gets in the way of what we genuinely need to be doing, which is how we work together to improve quality. I think that's where I see some of the issues in it. And to move on to the second part of it, in fee implications, I then think that that's where you then start to, there is a danger if, this is not going to happen because the fee system is a part of it, frankly, you're told how much to charge by government, and why would you do anything different? But if that changed and the fee cap was lifted, if institutions were encouraged or felt they needed to differentiate the fee they charge by someone's position based on NSS results, I'm not quite sure that would be a way of really valuing our higher education system. So I think there are big problems if that comes into play. It's not an implication at the moment. Where it does come into play is all of those conversations about value for money, which exist because of the system we've got, with tuition fees rather than anything to do with the NSS, I'd argue. I think just one more point, just probably should have said this earlier, but one of the issues that I have with it is that, particularly given the agenda that Million Plus supports, is that it's based on a very traditional notion of what a university experience is. You study as an undergraduate for 3 years, and in the third term of your third year, you do the survey, and it's It doesn't reflect on the moving in and out, the things that flexible provision, older learners, part-time learners. It's trying to judge a massively diverse set of experiences through one measurement tool, and I'm not sure how helpful that is. As I said, I think when we had nothing, it was a useful thing to do, and I think now we're in danger of people of it outstaying its welcome, so to speak. And if you read the review that Hefty published on performance indicators about what they would change with the NSS, it's almost like, well, we're just carrying on as we are, really. Everything's okay, and that doesn't strike me as necessary. When you think about the huge review that's about to occur on quality assurance, and thinking about whether quality assurance for the next number of years is going to be fit for purpose with different experiences and different providers, and more demands and different kinds of regulation. We're looking quite introspectively and in depth at how we do quality assurance, and yet we just seem to have got into a bit of a rut about the NSS, I think. So I think that's it. It's sort of outstayed its welcome. I think it's welcome, but I think it needs to do a little bit more, be able to do a little bit more, and if we can't, then we need to look at other ways to measure what's important rather than what we can measure.
Thank you very much.
Hi, so I'm Bethan Dudas, and I have had a really significant promotion. I am not the alternate director for NUS. Apologies if I gave the wrong information. I'm the Senior Campaigns and Policy Officer in the Higher Education team at NUS, and I work for Megan Dunn, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, and she's the elected officer for Higher Education. In case you don't know, NUS, as Alan outlined, Million Plus, we're an organisation that represents 7 million students across the UK, and through student unions, and we represent students in further and higher education. We have a wide range of campaigns that we work on, and higher education is but one. But the one that I care most passionately about, so that's great that I get to work at NUS. I'm going to, Alan mentioned the NSS as being a proxy for quality, and I'm going to take the title of this session as a proxy for students as consumers. So I think that's really what it was driving at, the NSS and the implications, and I'm talking a little bit about that agenda and what NUS thinks about students as consumers in general. And I want to start talking about, well, when you go and buy a cinema ticket or a sandwich or a pair of jeans, you have a kind of a basic set of expectations that will be met. But when you go into higher education, you don't expect, you expect to be challenged. You don't expect a sandwich to challenge you. You don't expect a pair of jeans, as much as the advertising agency would like you to think. You don't expect a pair of jeans to change the way you see the world. And it's by that very endeavour that I don't think higher education can be considered a consumer product at all. And the students as consumers agenda is one that's really damaging for the way in which we interact between universities, institutions, teachers, academics and students. Alternatively, NUS believes that NUS should be a partnership. Education should be a partnership. And what we mean by that is it's an active decision to treat and act with students as equal members of the academic community. Now that doesn't mean that they have equal knowledge, it doesn't mean that they have the same responsibilities, but that means that they have responsibilities towards driving a better education. Now, one of the things in that is that students will need support in doing that, and especially when we talk about what's happening in primary and secondary education and the way in which students are treated there. We need to help students learn how to be partners as well. And actually yesterday, NUS jointly launched a framework for partnership with the UK, which helps outline how to use particularly student charters in driving a culture of partnership in your institution and really bringing them to life. And what we kind of think helps do that is a simple cycle of creating, disseminating and reviewing that embed principles of a charter into your institution, and actually embed it further than in your institution, actually in your departments where you are. Actually, what does that mean? What does that look like to review something with the people that it most affects? Having a policy and that sits centrally and don't mean anything to the actual practice of learning is not productive, and just doesn't usually work. I mean, I'm sure so many of you have institutional-wide policies on all sorts of things that when you sit and read, you go, well, that might work for the other department, but that's not how we do it, and that doesn't address these particular nuances that we have. And so creating a system where at the lowest, at the most kind of closest possible level to those who are experiencing education get to be part of making the decision. And the reason I kind of mentioned student charters and the kind of framework for partnership as well is that student charters came out of a similar time, I think, when fees were rising and this kind of idea that students needed some rights that needed to be protected. And I absolutely believe that students need protections in place and they have rights, but I don't believe that's based on their identity as a consumer. It's based on their identity as a student. They have the right to have the things they need to learn to be a student, not because they're paying money for it, but because they're a student. But that's kind of a digression. I could rant about that all day. But the point is that we put a particular framing on the student charter when it first came in about consumer rights and about protections, and a lot of the student charters that were created back a couple of years ago went through university legal departments to check that they weren't going to get sued by a student if they didn't provide the various bit of information that they promised they would. Now, the point is that we applied that. We applied that narrative. Things, the student charter and the NSS don't have, they're tools. They don't think, they don't act, and they can't speak. They're things that we can use to help us drive what we believe education should look like. And that's absolutely what I think the NSS should be. I think it's a fantastic set of information. I think it's got so much that it can tell us, but it is limited. It's a snapshot. It's a snapshot, as Anna mentioned, of third-year students, which is a very linear, a very standard way of education being experienced by students, of their satisfaction, which is one particular question and one particular answer. But actually, if you ask students, are they satisfied? Asking them what they care about, I think you'll get a very different scenario of answers and a different discussion. And so that's why I think that the NSS is a useful tool to be used to, and any survey actually, like your institutional internal surveys, your departmental surveys, whatever you do, should be the start of the conversation, not the end of it. And that decision shouldn't be made on the basis of a survey result, but it's a place to start asking more questions. And that's where a system of partnership with your students uses that information to have those conversations. We've been talking about partnership for about 3 years now. When we first kind of launched our manifesto for partnership, we worked with some student unions about how they could get activity going. And Liverpool Hope Student Union came up with an absolutely fantastic scheme. I'm not sure if they're still running it, but they did run it for a little while, whereby they gave every course rep £3 to go and take out their course leader for a cup of coffee at the start of the year. Because it's about the conversation. And when a student gets into a committee room, a student staff liaison committee, a quality assessment review thingy, the dynamic is really different. And being able to be active from the start, and that's really difficult. But just by virtue of saying, go have a cup of coffee in our coffee shop, so we get the money back. And talk to your module leader, talk to your course leader, and find out why they run the course, find out what they care about, what are they excited about this year, what are they worried about this year, and begin that dialogue about the things that are important to you, so you can set those agendas. And just that made such a difference in how you can have those conversations with students. And it is about creating partnerships in our classrooms and kind of driving innovation. And one of the things that we are talking about this year is about how we give students more agency in their own learning. And we've published a document called Radical Interventions in Learning and Teaching Spaces, and that talks about going beyond students being involved in the decision making about their course, but actually being actively involved in delivery of the learning as well. You know, what spaces happen outside the classroom? We have a, you may be aware, you may be from one of the institutions at the moment, a wave of occupations going across students' campuses. And back in 2010, if you recall, NUS and Students' Union's involvement in some conversations about education in 2010, there were, again, a wave of occupations where so much exciting practice happened, where you had lecturers and academics coming into occupations to talk about, you know, the issues that were happening, to bring in different experiences and students teaching each other. And these are spaces where it's not accredited and it's not assessed, but they're really exciting spaces where students can learn. And that bit where I talked about at the start, where your perception of the world is changed and you're challenged, that can happen. So how can you combine those things where students can be more involved both inside and outside of the classroom in changing that? The last thing I want to talk about is about what's coming up and actually about students being involved in session interaction. And I've had a platform here today to talk about a particular thing that I think is interesting, and NSS has that platform, and to set out our agendas and our ideas. But one of the key challenges that I'd like to give to you is to do that too. We have a general election coming up, we have a space where we can challenge framing, we can agree with it, we can disagree with it. But if we are not talking, and you as people who are leaders in your communities, talking about the things that you care about, then the debate is really narrow. And it's just, are students consumers or are they partners? Or what kind of consumers are they? Or how high should we raise tuition fees? And the debate doesn't talk about the things that we care about. So unless you're taking a platform, whether that be a public one or in your classrooms or in your coffee shops or with your friends and family and talking about these things and widening out the debate, then we risk losing a great opportunity for making education more what we want it to be and keep building on that we want to grow. So yeah, I challenge you to that. And I've veered wildly away from NSS and field implications, but I hope it's been interesting to think about students as consumers or as partners.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. If I should say the words Mickey Mouse, there might be a check on whether those at the back can maybe I didn't get much reaction, so obviously not, but I have a presentation which I want to do three things. I want, I suppose, briefly to try and establish some kind of typology for responses to the NSS, and to look at what I think is some of the most beneficial approaches to the NSS as it currently stands. I want to briefly set the NSS in context with other similar kinds of satisfaction surveys I think we were invited to do earlier. And then finally I want to explore some of the potential implications of the future for the student satisfaction survey. And I am going to talk a little about the University of Huddersfield, where I'm the Provost Chancellor for Teaching and Learning, I'm afraid.
You've won an award recently, haven't you?
I think you might hear me mention that. I suspect there are none of my colleagues present in the room, but well, if there were, I'm almost contractually obliged to mention the fact that we've won some awards recently. So thank you very much. The University of Huddersfield, about 22,000 students, single campus university. About 1,000 of those students are postgraduate research students. A fairly broad range of provision, as I'm sure you know, medical school and a rather unusual school education, that we don't have much conventional teacher training, but we do have a very large post-compulsory element in our teacher training, but apart from that, it's a fairly broad spectrum of provision from creative arts through physical sciences, computing engineering, business, professional services, very large music provision. I suppose significant provision in most areas, including a small but fairly formed politics department. Our Chancellor is very well known, Professor Patrick Stewart, and we have a royal patron, I think, something we only share with about 5 other institutions, and as the colleague has just very kindly reminded us, we have won a few awards recently. One of them, which I suspect you weren't thinking of, is the fact that we've won some Queen's Awards. One of them for the fact that we're one of the fastest growing institutions in terms of our international student population. For the last few years we've been growing in terms of applications and new enrolments between 25 and 30% in the year. And obviously that puts particular pressures on an institution to respond to that kind of change. But I think the sort of issue you were referring to is that, of course, the fact that we were Entrepreneurial University of the Year with the Chancellor Education, and then subsequently we've just stopped being, because Edgehill are now our successors, but we were the University of the Year. So I shall stop doing that element of the presentation, and I shall emphasise that you'll think I'm bragging again, but this is important certainly for the things I say later. University of Huddersfield for 2 years in succession has been a #1 in the ESA Security Index based on 4 measures of financial strength. So, for example, the University of Huddersfield has no debt. It makes a very significant surplus as a proportion of its turnover. And that's in spite of the fact that, as some of you will know, it was one of the institutions that chose not to set a £9,000 fee when it had the opportunity to do so. In fact, it set a fee starting with a 7, which was quite an unusual and I think brave step to take at that time. Now, approaches to management of the NSS. It seems to me that they broadly fall into 3 categories. There's an approach which addresses what some people call hygiene factors. So the most dramatically problematic aspects of provision are addressed usually in a fairly dramatic manner through, for example, course closures or rationalisations where significant organisational deficits have been identified. I think probably the most common response is what's, I have to say, essentially a deficit model. Very good presentation, very good publication from the HA recently on what works. And it seems to me that most of those approaches to the NSS are essentially either a deficit model or what one might consider the opposite of a deficit model. Really taking the data from the survey and then using some kind of action planning process. In the best cases, in conjunction with the students themselves, to try and identify what those factors are which are either causing a drag on the survey results or where they are causing positive results on the survey, and then addressing those specifically. I think thirdly, and I do think this is relatively rare, and I would say it's even relatively rare in an institution like Huddersfield, a response to the survey which is genuinely strategically aligned, where students and staff work to develop on the results of the survey in such a way as to move an institution along the lines of the institutional strategy rather than simply responding to the immediate response to the data. And the case that I give here is the university's response on the question assessment and feedback. As we know, this was a sector-wide problem. Going back to 2008, in Huddersfield it was pretty catastrophic. We had less than, quite significantly less than 2/3 of students expressing satisfaction with the 5 questions on assessment and feedback. There was no question we had to do something about it, even if it hadn't been for the student union, and in particular the president at that time, Junaid, identifying this, we understood that something needed to be done. We took an approach which was extremely systematic. It was, I think, it was fundamentally aligned with the institution's goals, facilitated by somebody who had some considerable expertise in this area, Brenda Smith, led by one of my colleagues now retired, National Teaching Fellow, Mike Russ, and it brought in a cross-sectional team which did include a significant presence from the student union, from the student body, and indeed a cross-sectional team of the institution itself, so not just senior managers but people in different roles in the institution. That produced a strategy which did, I suppose, the things that, looking back, one would have expected it to do, but it ensured an alignment between the assessment that we were undertaking and the outcomes of the courses and modules that were being assessed. It significantly diversified the assessment techniques that we were using at the time. There was a lot of emphasis on the development of constructive feedback mechanisms to make sure that students were being told not just what they were doing wrong, but also how they could improve and do better in assessed work. And very specific issue, but it was a very important one, development of common understandings about what timely return of feedback meant. And I think in particular when that was implemented, what has become very, very deeply rooted in the student consciousness in Huddersfield, the 3-week rule, which is the idea that work is returned more or less exactly on the 3-week point, is something that really, as a process of negotiation, emerged as an understanding in terms of the benefit to students of timely return, alongside the pressures that puts on academic colleagues. A lot of things fed out of that, so there's been a lot of CPD that has been necessary. In conjunction again with the HEA, led by my colleague Wilma Teavey at Bale in accountancy, we had an equip project which worked specifically on CPD related to assessment and feedback. And some of you may also know we are distinctive as an institution because of the emphasis we place on professional recognition, and in particular professional recognition with an emphasis on work in this area. So all colleagues with a substantive teaching role in Huddersfield have professional recognition through the HEA as fellows of the HEA. And when we do that, and most colleagues have gone through either our own PGCHE or our own workshops towards individual recognition, when we do that, there is a very strong emphasis on good practice in assessment and feedback. We also did a lot of work on the technological support for this area, various different aspects to this, but it's worth picking one out. We have a module assessment timetable, which in a very slick way organises clearly for students who may be on quite complex module diets, a very clear statement of the way that the assessment brief, the hand-in date, the return date is going to be organised for them. And that was in the, it was actually presented in the IT initiative category at the Times Higher Leadership and Management Awards in 2012. And it was up against institutions with multi-million-pound IT installations. It didn't win, but it was highly commended. Hardly cost anything. It was just a very clever solution to an organisation problem. Outcomes, well, as I say, we started back in 2008 with a catastrophic score in this area. By 2011, it had moved to 76%. It was the best in the country among mainstream universities, so conventional delivery universities. And in 2012, we managed to improve further, which I think was a reasonable result for that kind of activity. Looking at an average position, we've managed to maintain, in spite of student expectations rising in this area, maintain a reasonably strong position. As I say, I think it was important, this was strategically aligned. It was undertaken with a view not just to addressing the NSS, but out of a recognition that we were significantly below par in terms of the proportion of our students who were achieving first and 2-1s. And there was clearly an important aspect to that, which was around our practice in assessment and feedback. So back in 2008, we had also identified that only having 54% of our students achieving first and 2-1s was clearly not adequate. By this last summer, we had almost hit 65%, and I have to emphasise to the sceptics amongst you that there has been no change to the classification methodology at the University of Huddersfield. Of course, we have had other factors impinging on that. Our staff are no doubt even more brilliant than they were back in 2008. Our estate has continued to improve, and as I've said on the slide, our entry points performance has improved. Not hugely, but it has improved. Even so, I think it's undeniable that our practice around assessment and feedback has helped us to drive other areas of strategic significance. I do want to mention my politics colleagues because I have to say they have been they've been front runners in that whole area. And one sign, I think, of that is the fact that if you look at their results, and I've actually given their results across all of the questions on the survey here, so not just the 5 on assessments and feedback, they are particularly strong as a group of innovators. So looking at their average scores across questions 1 to 22, you can see an average score of 87, 95 in 2012, 94 in 2013, back to 89 in this most recent survey. But it significantly outstripped their peers, more or less, in sociology and history. And I think you can see that can be fed back into some of the work they've done. For example, they're pioneers around the use of oral feedback. One of my politics colleagues observed to me recently that politics colleagues may write fast, but they talk even faster. And therefore, the use of oral feedback is something that students don't just find particularly accessible and beneficial, but it's also more efficient for politics colleagues to use. As we perhaps step back from that and start to think about where we are in terms of satisfaction surveys overall, possibly worth just reflecting, and I'm sure you're aware of this, but perhaps just worth reminding us, politics stands reasonably well as a discipline. This is the question 22 sector average. I should have dug out the score across all 22 questions, because I do think that is more meaningful actually, but if we do just look at question 22, you can see that over the last 3 or 4 years, politics has been pretty stable at 87, 88%, which is a good score. It's significantly ahead of some of the weaker JACS level 3 areas in the survey, so it's significantly ahead of the weaker brethren, well, in the whole of the UK in areas like journalism and media studies. Possibly a little bit behind some of the stronger, as you can see at the foot of the screen, but still a fairly good performance. And I think earlier on we were encouraged, perhaps, to do a little bit of self-congratulatory, thinking about where we sit alongside other client satisfaction surveys. I know you can stretch these in every direction you want, but if you look at service industries, if you look at the Ofgem broad measure of customer satisfaction, this was the most recent one I could find. For electricity, they give a measure of 80%, which, if we take the question 22 average this year at 86, is not bad. Even if we take the questions 1 to 22 average, which this year was at 81%, that's not bad, not a bad comparison for HE to be able to make. I have a colleague who does presentations and continually refers to the JD Power Vehicle Ownership Satisfaction Study as a basis for, as it were, a consumer good. I do think this covers a whole variety of oddities because, of course, the range of scores here is massive, absolutely massive. But at the overall score there for cars as a whole is 78%, so again we outperform cars. In fact, it does put us somewhere around the brand score for Jaguar. The brand score for Jaguar, I think, this year is 85 or 86%, which is not bad. And of course, it significantly outperforms most public services. So the NHS, the British Social Attitudes Survey score for the NHS overall is 60%, which has dropped, as I'm sure you know, very significantly since 2010 when it went up as high as 70%. So where does that take us in terms of the implications for the survey for the future? Well, I think we do have some scope for self-congratulation, although I do think we have to be careful about taking that too far. We've clearly got some evidence which would allow us to claim progress ahead of other sectors. Indeed, we could claim that while other parts of what might broadly be called the public sector have been going backwards, we have been continuing to progress. But I do think we have to enter some notes of caution. I do think that the pressures of resourcing and the turbulence that's about to hit us in terms of the opening of the market, they are bound to have an effect. And if I refer back to my slide on the University of Huddersfield's financial security, I think the fact that we have a significant way to go in Huddersfield before we hit the £9,000 cap, and the fact that that is not the situation that colleagues in the room may be in their institutions, is bound to have an impact on the quality of service that institutions are going to be able to offer to students. I do also think that we are going to enter a world in which the negative impacts of the unintended consequences of the survey are likely to become clearer and clearer. I think it is inevitable that institutional management, particularly because of those resource pressures, institutional management is bound to become more interested in managing for the margin. And managing for the margin is going to put a lot of pressure on disciplines in institutional portfolios that appear to be underperforming. I have to say, and I think it's wonderful that organisations like yours are so active and effective. There's a significant role for disciplines in the years going forward to look collectively at the way that they can move their discipline as a whole forward in the survey. I showed you the chart for politics, and although that score of about 87 to 88% is good, it has been stable for the last few years, and it is, I think, important that politics as a whole is in a position to move itself as a JACS Level 3 code forward. I think also there is a danger that institutions may focus too heavily on those hygiene factors, which I think can lead to very crude decision making. Even, I have to say, that institutions can focus simply on that responsive deficit model action planning type of response. Even if that is done brilliantly, and I think there are some institutions that have made huge progress in the last few years, mainly through work on an essentially on a deficit model action planning basis. Even if it's done very effectively with students, and I think that is when it's done best, it can just produce a world of higher education in which the perfect academic emerges as someone who is sympathetic, mildly amusing and slightly unchallenging, which I think is the danger that was identified earlier. Any attempt to manage through a metric is always going to damage its usefulness, and I do think we're getting to that point now with the NSS, however it develops in the next few years. And I think because of that, a whole range of other people with a stake in the game are going potentially to look at other proxies for what they are fundamentally interested in. Whether those are closely aligned, so other in-course satisfaction measures, and there are many emerging, which may be seen to be more subtle or more effective, or more distant ones, whether those are surveys taken after graduation, for example, surveys taken after graduation, particularly when they're framed in terms of questions about value for money, which I think are particularly powerful, or employer measures focused on their satisfaction, such as the UK Commission measures of employer satisfaction, or, I'm afraid, just the hard numbers around earnings and imputed economic benefit arising from particular student cohorts. All of them, I think, unfortunately, present much harder messages for HE, and even, I have to say, potentially for the people sitting in the room, than the NSS does in its current form, and than the sorts of approach to the NSS that we've seen to this present moment would offer.
Thank you very much indeed, Tim. I think we've got 10 minutes or so for questions. If you put up your hand and I say can you ask a question, could you say who you are and your institution?
I'm Lee Marson from UEA. Understandably, I'm quite like the NSS results, but NSS 4 because we've done quite well at it. But two questions really, I guess, to Bethan, really, is this idea of partnership. And what I've experienced in teaching in my own institution is that although there are greater demands as a result of the increase in fees, there is not an increase in student participation involvement. So for this week, most of us have been teaching and probably find that the numbers, the attendance is no better than it was 5 years ago. So in terms of this partnership, what the university doing in terms of surrounding encourage students to actually take a more active part in their own education? And then, I hope this is an unfair question, but it's interesting, I think, to Tim. Your figures for the NSS have dropped in the last 2 years. And I'm just wondering if you see that as any sort of correlation with increase of fees during that time period.
First, I'd like to apologise for my coughing fit in the middle of Tim's presentation. Apologies for that. In terms of students taking more active part in their education and that you haven't seen a change, and I think it's interesting around, again, how, if you define students as consumers, or if we define them as, or we think that actually we shouldn't be saying, oh, because of a fee this, it should be taking more of a role. But actually, it's about finding out what students want to engage in, how they want to engage. So if you're not turning up to a lecture, why? Is it the content? Is it the format? Is it something that we can do together differently? Is it just that you're choosing not to? And actually you're just doing all your research and learning in the library, which is often happens with students. But I guess the point I got to is I don't have the answers, it's the conversation with the students and about creating that space and saying, well, and that conversation about, well, the reason that we do it this way is because this is this is in all my years of experience as a teacher, the most effective way, and you can challenge in that way. So just if you're not coming, this is what, why. And I don't think that students are always right at all. But I do think that they should be involved in a conversation about how they learn. In terms of what we're doing, we work through students' unions, and that's how we are most effective, especially in the classroom when it's devolved to you and to students to define what that looks like. So we run particularly course rep training and programs that try and support course reps to be more tooled up to engage in conversations that happen in university, because they can be quite scary and they can be quite dry sometimes. And so it's about trying to help students to be able to talk about things. So when they first articulate something, it might not be very helpful to you because of the way they express it. So how do we push that a little bit more and say, okay, think about this a bit more. What are you actually driving at here? What are you actually saying isn't working for you? What are you saying is working for you? And to what level are we, as the teachers, comfortable with this not working for you? Because sometimes it's not going to work for you, it's going to push you harder. And sometimes it's not okay, you're being really exclusive for a particular type of student. You want to change that. So it's that conversation. I don't know if that's a particularly constructive answer.
And the short answer to the question about whether a fee change affected the NSS score is that we don't believe that it did. You're quite right that we have started slowly to move our fee up from the initial 7950, but the text comments that we recorded in that most recent survey don't have any, they don't give us a suggestion that any change in that fee has been a part of any concern that students have. In general, I have to say it's been accepted remarkably straightforwardly. It's been explained very clearly. It's been part of the general lifting costs that the institution is facing. And I think the institution's initial stance, setting the fee below £8,000, was much more powerful as a signal than any change that will take place.
Thanks, Rosie. Paul Carmichael, University of Ulster University, as we've been rebranded, I should say, and PSA on secretary. I was reflecting on the contributions, and it occurred to me that NSS probably a good thing and inevitable in this age of measuring things. Fees probably a bad thing, but also inevitable. The link between them questionable. And coming from Northern Ireland, where fees have remained at the pre-high level of the English model, one wonders if really the introduction of them and then the acceleration in the English cartel, because it's not a market, it's clearly dysfunctional, has really made any impact at all on this vague concept of satisfaction. And of course then there's a Scottish dimension where of course as yet no fees, and if Mr Salmon's promise on the stone or the rock is they'll never come either. A couple of things. Firstly, I recall colleagues in the United States saying where fees are often very much higher than in much of the British sector, saying that that had not necessarily had any implication for how students, whether they were consumers or partners, related to their institutions and their academics, and in fact academics jealously guarded their freedom and independence and were not going to be, as it were, shoehorned into being responsive to the consumer in that very narrow sense. Another point, I wonder what the panel might feel about the encroachment of the private providers into higher education. Because, of course, the current administration has been particularly proactive in that regard, and with every prospect it will continue. And the final point, in a sense, the comparisons with the other areas are interesting. NHS, 60%, the most loved institution in Britain, surprising. Power companies, or electricity, the companies everyone, like banks, love to hate, but obviously that didn't take into account pricing in that survey. And in a sense, because the fees are paid by the vast majority of students, or for the vast majority of students, by the student loan company, and hence it's a post-dated check on the taxpayer's behalf. One wonders if you asked them in 20 years' time about their transaction, what they might feel about all of this. But, so it's not really a question of these comments.
I might just respond on that sort of the possibility of the fees being charged to affect the NSS scores. I think the only answer is that we don't know, because no one being charged £9,000 a year has taken the NSS yet. They'll do that next January, February, March. So that would be the point when we'll see if there are any effects. And obviously, we shouldn't rush to judgment on the basis of whatever comes out next year. But Germany finds it not inevitable to charge fees. And what I can remember from my looks at the Times Higher rankings, they don't seem to be doing too badly around the world. They don't, from what I can remember, don't have an NSS either. So people do things differently. And say NSS in Scotland, but no fees. In Scotland, Scottish higher education is actually very strong and has very strong standing in the world. So I think it is quite interesting that angle. And I wonder if we could get a research project going. There we go. On those sorts of things and those relationships. I think with private providers or alternative providers or whatever we're calling them this week, that's interesting as well, because they have a tendency to set lower fees than the 9,000, partly because they pick their market very carefully, and they only do that. They don't do everything else that your institutions do, particularly research. And providing students with the opportunity to do research is an important part of their experience. So I think it, as that brought more into the sort of the mix, what we need to look at what the differences are and why there are differences. I mean, a student going to a private provider is making a very deliberate choice to go to that private provider, very specifically turning against the traditional market. And so we'll have a different set of expectations, almost certainly. And I think with the US system, I think it's difficult to really, although our government likes, the English government likes to, or Westminster government likes to compare, it is a very different system. The debt is ridiculous. The dropout withdrawal rates are ridiculous. The default rate is ridiculous. The bursary systems are ridiculous, but in a good way. So I think that our government has a tendency to look to the US on a whole host of things. It's problematic. I think we should be looking to what our European counterparts are doing, and that they probably have better examples.
Haven't got very much longer for questions. Have you any more? Or
Well, I'm just saying, I do think that the assumption that the demand is insensitive to price and quality, which I think underlay part of what you said, it may have been true for parts of the market in the past, but already there are parts of the market that are showing themselves to be much more sensitive to price and to markers of quality. Anyone who competes ferociously in the international market understands already how very important particular combinations of price and quality are, and indeed some parts of the home EU market are already very sensitive to, and I can only see that becoming more the case rather than less.
Is anyone desperate to ask a question? In which case, I suggest we thank our speakers. Thank you very much indeed, all three of you. I suggest we take a very, very brief 2-minute comfort break for anyone who needs one, starting